All right. Thank you very much, Mai. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. I'm a historian. My work is at the intersection of political history, cultural history, and social history. So I'm not in literature, but I'm actually very interested, and I work a lot with literature, especially with poetry, not so much in terms of its literary content, but rather as an expression of a very strong social force and a great deal of social meaning in Arab society. Middle Eastern society includes Persian society. I think there's nothing that touches the Arab soul, the Persian soul, as much as poetry. Poetry and song are very closely connected in these societies, and they play a very important role, have played a very important role for centuries, for millennia, if you will. I am here to introduce our panelists. I will introduce them as they are about to give their presentations. For those, I don't know if that's common knowledge yet, but unfortunately, Professor Muhsin Al-Musawi was not able to join us for today, so you will have to bear with me as I will read out his paper today, but I will introduce him nevertheless. Professor Al-Musawi is a very well-known scholar of classical and modern Arabic literature and comparative cultural studies, who has for a number of years now been teaching at Columbia University, but I think he's Iraqi by origin. He is the recipient of the 2002 Uwais Award in Literary Criticism, and his interests include the post-colonial Arabic novel. He teaches Arabic language teaching theories, but also Arabic poetry. What else would an Iraqi do than teach Arabic poetry? The title of the paper that I'm going to read out is The Creative Principle and Canon Formation. Jubran, Khalil Jubran, Jubran, Khalil Jubran, and Mikhail Naimy. This might go a little over the 20 minutes that are assigned, but who's gonna stop me if I'm the chair of this panel? And also, I really have no power to abridge this paper, so please just, again, as I said, bear with me. Although creativity as a cultural term has been in use in ancient and medieval Arabic literature, literary criticism, and philological inquiry, the turn it takes in Mahjari writings goes beyond the Badi' tradition and its specific figurative referentiality. Its use in Gibran's and Naimy's writings is not confined to strangeness as a canonical criterion in Harold Bloom's reading, neither is it a poetic principle per se. It is the opening up of wide horizons, a perpetuation of human imaginative explorations, and hence a breakup with imitativeness, stagnation, and sterility in language and thought. It departs from traditionalist technique, but engages with literary tradition in its dynamic and mutative process. Its power and noticeable growth stem from a strong sense of individual experience and conversation with a pantheistic order. Entrenched between the philological and the semantic, the creativity principle is worth reckoning with in terms of literary and cultural movements. Its use often presents it as a mutative force to destabilize norms and it questions certainties. In other words, it runs against canon formation. Gibran's and Naimy's effort works within a specific milieu, the Mahjar, and its publications. Propelled by a desire to interact with the homeland, the group's endeavor established its own network, a grid of dialogues like the ones between Gibran and Maiziyadeh and Emil Zaidan, for example. Correspondence plays a significant role in disseminating conceptualizations of creativity and enabling it to be among the basic theoretic concerns. Along with Mahjar publications, the venue of correspondence cannot be overestimated. It helped focusing an otherwise diversified cultural movement. The outcome, as shown in their writings, tends to contemplate their presence in North and South America, their commitment to their homeland, their understanding of literary innovation in dialogue with Romanticism in its English and American manifestations in particular, but also in close interaction with 19th century Russian literature, and engagement with traditions and the contemporary movement in writing and translation in Egypt and Asham. In criticism, both Gibran and Naimy prove to be of an everlasting presence and impact. In Nuaym's Ghirbal, published in 1923, and Gibran's writings, creativity is a process. And the latter's understanding it is a third eye that is above sense, and hence as perceptive, insightful, and prophetic as to elude logic and empirical reasoning. The poet, as the seer, has the combined disposition of the madman and the prophet, his famous eponymous titles. Ahead of other explorations, including Michel Foucault's comparison of the poet and the madman, Gibran discerns creativity as an illumination, an epiphany, which his later followers like Ameen trace among the Sufis and Ibn Arabi in particular. Michel Foucault argues the difference and similarity between the poet and the madman. The latter, I quote, loads all signs with a resemblance that ultimately erases them, while the poet brings similitude to the signs that speak it, end of quote. They, and I quote again, share that frontier situation, a marginal position, and a profoundly archaic silhouette, where their words unceasingly renew the power of strangeness and the strength of their contestation, end of quote. But let us read Gibran's celebration of Nuaym's Al-Ghirbal to see how he collapses poetry and criticism as a two-sided activity that stems from a poetic origin. I quote, "It is the first breeze of that divine tempest which shall weed out all the dead wood in our literary forests," end of quote. His understanding of criticism as a volcanic eruption to put an end to a landscape of ruins is unique, but it also corresponds with Percy Shelley's Ode to the West Wind, by which the Arab Nahda romantics were enthralled. The West Wind operates as destroyer and regenerator. Gibran's celebration of Al-Ghirbal is unlimited. He writes, I quote, "Had you not been a poet and writer, you would not have reached your goal of critic, and you would not have succeeded in lifting the curtain to reveal the truth about poetry, poets, writing, and writers," end of quote. To prove his point that one needs to be a poet in heart to criticize poetry, he explains, I quote, "Sainte-Beuve, Ruskin, and Walter Pater were artists before and after they criticized the artistic works of others, and each one of them criticized through the help of the light of their own inner feelings and not through the help of acquired taste," end of quote. End of quote. Gibran is bent on an association that takes a transcendental poetics as a start. This applies to the three whom he cites, especially Walter Pater. The engagement with modernity as landscape of ruins is not to his taste, not because his tempest is void of his association of death and rebirth, but because he strongly believes in poetry as necessarily spiritual and divine, and hence is not a product of contrivance and acquisition. I quote, "The spiritual light that comes from within is the source of everything beautiful and noble. This light turns criticism into a fine and magnificent art." He adds, "Without this light, criticism is compulsory and boring and lacking the positive note of decisive persuasion," end of quote. To comprehend this understanding of criticism, it is worthwhile to compare it to Abbas Mahmoud al-Aqad's criticism, whose preface to The Sieve is no less celebratory. It combines, however, the romantic notion of prophecy with poetry of feeling. This combination corresponds to the English Romantics' credo and was the core understanding of the Diwan group that includes Al-Aqad, Al-Mazini, and Shukri. Al-Aqad remains different from Gibran because the latter is more visionary in his style that often departs from the communicative to the expressive and from the expressive to the imaginative. Al-Aqad is more at home with a comparative reading of the literary scene. I quote, "What I notice in this book is a writer who grieves on our shabby state of a scene without poetry, where there is no poetry of feeling and thought, but a poetry of occasions and events." End of quote. Naimy claims the prophet is prophet, not an acrobat, and poetry is inspiration, not trickery. In other words, inspiration is conflated with creativity. The creative principle for both Gibran and Naimy stems from this inspiration. It ties well with a pre-Islamic understanding of the muse, and hence with the poet as the obsessed, the mad, and the seer. They preserve exemplary classical cases and names, but both perceive the canon as an ongoing process, a canon against itself, as long as temporality entails an incoming outdatedness and obsolescence. This line in reading canonization in terms of perpetuity, affirmation, and negation ultimately engages with universalism and humanity worldwide, as opposed by both Gibran and Naimy. But it is well grounded in a purposeful endeavor to open up Arab culture in a forward movement. As this aspiring endeavor was only in process, and hence in the making, as shown in Gibran's letters and writing, and in Naimy's Ghirbal, it was in dialogue with a seething climate of ideas in Arab culture, a climate that was distinguished by negativity. Apart from the massive movement towards rejuvenation and revitalization, the striding mood was negative. Indeed, the trendy ihya, or resurrection, admits in its term a negative principle. You need to realize death to search for rebirth. The stark scene of negativity was not particularly Arab, for it was worldwide for different reasons and from different perspectives. Amid scenes of colonialist expansion, wars, and increasing awareness of individual and communal calamities, poets and writers felt the pangs of being outcasts, the illegitimate legislators and lonely prophets, unrecognized but bound to speak up. This understanding involves, quote, consciousness of the discontinuity of time, a break with tradition, a feeling of novelty, a vertigo in the face of the passing moment, unquote, writes Foucault of the general concept. The emerging speaker in a large number of writings is not at home with himself or with the outside world. It is only in relation or opposition to an external reality that modernity could define itself. Gibran's admiration for Naimy's Ghirbal derives from its base in understanding poetry as a creation, and hence the difference between two critical methods. One of sublimation that elevates the poetic as necessarily creative for being prophetic, dreamlike, inspirational, and partaking of the divine. And another that denies its originality because it is a human literary production. Gibran practices his sublimated understanding in The Madman and The Prophet, among other writings. Naimy is rather careful in navigating a third way which is probably impacted by Tolstoy and Belinsky. Even his title for The Sieve could have come through Tolstoy's words. I quote, "In order to find glory in art, it is necessary to collect a lot of material and sift it through the sieve of criticism." End of quote. His study at Poltava Seminary led him to study 19th century Russian literature very closely. Patriots got engaged with other milieus and environs. His deep involvement in Russian literature, its neat combination of spiritualism and realism prompted a sharp critical sense, a comparative framework that turns also to a war against whatever he perceives as drab and threadbare. He writes of that period, quote, "This was a period of abundant literary harvest, a period in which my thinking came to the boil, a period for me of outbursts of feelings and spiritual growth. And this opened my eyes to the pettiness with which my country occupied itself, as indeed did all the Arab countries, indeed the whole of the East, particularly in the realm of thought, art, and literature." Unquote. This engagement with Russian literary studies manifests itself in a number of positions that have placed his criticism at the crossroads of Arab writing. He is in agreement with a number of Arab writers, like the Diwan group, Taha Hussein, and Maiziyadeh, for example, but he's more in controversy with the rejuvenationalists. Poetry is the breath of life, and only poems that sound so deserve attention because, quote, "outward attributes, the structuring of the composition, musicality, and stylistic refinement, along with meter, prosody, and grammar, come last." End of quote. To be the breath of life, poetry is a selective recreation of the real in one's imagination. With this premise, he explains, quote, "You did not create anything, but rather you recreated real existing materials and natural scenes minus the superfluous, increased a dose here and there as deemed necessary, and then presented all in a way that was pleasing to the soul." End of quote. The poet here is not a creator but a producer, probably impacted by Belinsky. Naimy tries hard to bring literary production in line with a creative principle as partial inspiration. The realistic but sharp, sensitive awareness that distinguished Belinsky opened a gate for him which Gibran could not always conform to. To navigate along this thin thread implicates Naimy's criticism in many a problematic. His attitude was acceptable and highly appreciated by his fellow romantics in Egypt and the Arab world, and his rebelliousness won him Gibran, Rihani, and the rest of the Mahjari poets and writers. But there's anxiety and nervousness when it comes to reading and analyzing poetry. He is better attuned to present Belinsky as a guide. He writes, quote, "The defining particularities of Belinsky, the critic, were his strong adherence to his principles, his implacability towards compromise, and his rejection of all inconsistencies. He opposed timid and evasive criticism with that unbounded love of truth that knows no embellishment or omission. Belinsky's creative genius combined social pathos with philosophical reflection, aesthetic feeling with literary talent, and the gift of scholarly abstraction with poetical fantasy." End of quote. One can read through these attributes Naimy's aspiration to be the Arab Belinsky, especially in his reading of the canon, the prominent names in classical and medieval tradition, and his assessment of his contemporaries like Rihani, Gibran, Nasib Arida, and others. Naimy tries to play the same role, a role that strives hard to argue production and creation as a two-track literary pursuit. But as long as poetry demonstrates life in its varieties, aspirations, and limits, there is bound to be a differential poetic space that can highlight the most visible in each poet's or writer's corpus. Rihani is known for his ideas and thoughtful explorations, especially in A Chant of Mystics and Other Poems, published in 1921, where the entire volume is rich with an Arab aroma. That was a quote. When it comes to Gibran, Naimy is more inclined to collapse the author and the persona in the manner of Victorian readings of their predecessors, the Romantics. He argues as follows, quote, "The meaning of existence in Gibran's opinion is to seek what lies beyond its boundaries. The one whose soul is awake sees that he is surrounded by other souls that are still sound asleep in life's embrace, and she tries to wake them, but they do not wake up. And then he finds them strange, reproaches them, comes to hate them, and finally rises against them. At times, his hate leads him to recklessly exaggerate his blame and protest." End of quote. Gibran's rebels are against sluggishness, but their definition cannot be clear-cut. More important in his compatriots' critique is the emphasis on vastness as a romantic principle, a revolt against finitude and an aspiration for freedom. This principle is the common ground that brings the Mahjar together. In the case of Gibran and Naimy, the emphasis is laid on the linguistic field, the role of language as an arena for unfolding awareness. The field, with all its signs, signified and material or symbolic capital, relates to the dynamics of appropriation and use. Naimy believes in what Arab poets and rhapsodists used to say, that they originate Legacies, not the grammarians. For many centuries, writes Naimy, in, quote, "Lebanon had suffered a gloomy fate of silence until a certain moment when silence was impossible and the need to speak up was paramount. That was the moment when the first language they were to speak was that of Gibran." End of quote. In that same extensive article on Gibran's collection, he appraises with admiration Gibran's poetry and poetics, his melody, finesse, and beauty, but not his prose. He is the mutineer, the rebel whose mission was to initiate a storm that leaves nothing unearthed, including codes and formalities that have shackled expression of feelings. Naimy often writes of language as parole, but when it comes to poetry, he means an inclusive use, practice, speech, and writing. Thus, the innovators in poetry and prose for him are the ones who create, not imitate, and who depart from norms and not get codified and shackled. It is not difficult to notice that Naimy is more attuned to inventiveness in style and rebellion in thought. Language as an inclusive term for style is a concern for the whole Mahjar group. But for the critic in Naimy, it assumes that magnitude because it was, as it is always, the site of everyday practice. The equation with life is important for him, as it is important for Gibran. When Gibran wrote his article, Mustaqbal al-Lugha al-Arabiyya, the future of Arabic language, he establishes a dialectical relationship between communal life and creativity. I quote, "If the creative force gets numbed, language falters, regresses, and in regression there is death and extinction." End of quote. The matter is so for him because the poet, as an originator, not imitator, is the one to generate this power and vigor in language. Quote, "The poet is the father and mother of language, while the imitator is the weaver of its coffin and its gravedigger." End of quote. But the poet assumes large meanings for Gibran. It is an inclusive term for every inventor, discoverer, creator, life lover, and all who, quote, "stand with awe in the face of time, its days and nights," whether a philosopher or a vinery guard, end of quote. Language for him is a process that derives vigor from a nation's forward movement, its, quote, "hunger and thirst for the unknown," and its soul, a series of dreams to be realized. It is ingenuity and inventiveness among individuals and enthusiasm in communities, and its presence in individuals is the capacity to present hidden communal predispositions in corporeal and apparent forms. End of quote. He complains, quote, "In pre-Islamic times, the poet was on the alert because the Arabs were so, and he was to expand and grow during the days of pre- and Islamic times because the Arabs were passing that stage, and the poet continued to progress, grow, and change, appearing once as philosopher, then as physicist and astrologer until slumber overcame creativity in Arabic language, and it slept. And along the state of slumber, poets changed to versifiers, philosophers, to theologians, physicists, to deceivers, and astrologers, to diviners." End of quote. What holds this rebellious and striving critical insight together is the belief in creativity as an innovative, inventive, and ingenious process that escapes boundaries and resists canon formation. Mutative and progressive as this creativity is, it operates as an impulse, not a craft. While it is difficult to claim a theoretical framework for the mahjar, there is nevertheless the common understanding that Arabic literature and culture had to undergo radical innovation to come to grips with transformation and challenge at the turn of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Gibran stripped language of paraphernalia and embellishments and let it bear, like that of the Sufis, to speak up in plain but powerful words that gave the Nahda an important venue to explore creativity and craft. Thank you.